Listen, I love Insomniac. So, with all due respect, when I say this, you get what you pay for. Um, Bethesda put out, they put out Elder Scrolls, they put out Fallout, particularly Todd Howard's team. Two games that are consistently in Game of the Year conversation, even Game of the Generation conversation. Um, Insomniac just does not do that. And Bethesda's fans give them the capability of being this great. Bethesda creates tools that gives players control. It gives players player agency, um, and this gives their games longevity. PlayStation fans they hold back Insomniac and PlayStation. PlayStation gives you cinematics, which take away control and player agency. That's the big difference. Um, PlayStation fans hate anything that's not cinematic. See Haven Studios' Fear Games. They're already cursing out anything multiplayer, game as a service, experimental. So you get what you pay for, and you get uh, repercussions to your stifling of studio creativity. I'm getting Fair Games, hopefully, if it's good. The rest of you can stick with your watching the game play it for you in your PlayStation movie theater. Let's get on with it. So let's go ahead and go head to head with some games and see who really won. So here are the rules. I will not be counting any mostly cinematic trailers, nor will I be counting any trailers that didn't give you clarity on the game loop or what's new to the established game loop of an established franchise. So games like Fear Games, Sword of the Sea, Concord, and Revenant Hill will not be discussed on the Sony side. And on the Microsoft side, games like Fable, South of Midnight, Hellblade 2, and Forza Motorsport will not be discussed. This will be based on exclusives only, and the descriptions that the trailers and demonstrations gave, and the clarifications on the gameplay loop given during these showcases, not based on any exterior further research. When it comes to comparing these games, it's based on the demonstrations of the showcase. So let's start at the top and compare the two marquee franchises shown at these showcases. Comparing Spider Man and Starfield. Spider Man didn't stand a chance. There are certainly some new elements that are going to provide tons of fun in Spider Man in terms of the wingsuits, the character switching, and new gadgets, and the familiar powers of Spider Man. And it certainly gives you the idea that Spider Man will have the better overall story, but nowhere near the type of story that I believe will stick with you for the rest of your gaming life. Spider Man certainly has some good things going for it, but when it comes to Starfield, nah, no way. We're talking spaceship hijacks, pickpocketing, outpost crafting, NPC relationships and romance, NPC dialogue, explorable cities, game elements which will stick with you for months, even years. Whether you like storytelling and dialogue or gameplay tools and freedom, this is why I consider it possibly the game of the year, even over Tears of the Kingdom. Because regardless of what Zelda does with gameplay tools, there's nothing to write home about when it comes to storytelling and dialogue. Starfield is not only a game, it's an everyday life sim. And this is why I think Spider Man 2 doesn't really compare to Starfield. Next, let's compare the second best games from each showcase with Phantom Blade Zero and Clockwork Revolutions. While both of them seem to have some focus on storytelling, the characters they show for Clockwork certainly seem to be more engaging and intriguing. While most of the antagonist dialogue in Phantom Blade with other characters were your basic grunt soldier banter back and forth. Clockwork Revolution's stories certainly seemed like it's going somewhere, but Phantom Blade's story, at least from the trailer, seems like it's in the back burner. When it comes to gameplay, both seem like they have some interesting approaches. Phantom Blade Zero is action filled with what seems like unbelievable gameplay mechanics and sword fighting, reminiscent of old kung fu movies or movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I highly doubt gamers are parrying at that speed. It might be a button press, but there's probably much more to be explored with their combat in terms of how it really plays. But it certainly is flashy. It certainly is fast. It certainly has some Sekiro esque gameplay design. But just like we said in previous comparisons, this seemingly is outclassed by the amount of depth of gameplay mechanics in the Microsoft offering. Clockwork Revolution is giving you a control over time and seemingly telekinesis of some sort. So when you destroy a structure and it blocks your path, you can now rewind time on that structure to put it back in place so you can now continue on your path. And it seems like there's some consequences to your time usage. Now, whether that consequences all part of the story and cinematics, we don't know. It's seemingly so, but I think the play with time is a little less typical of what we see in gaming. And I think the environment for Clockwork and the city is much more interesting than in Phantom Blade Zero. I will say this about Phantom Blade Zero. If we're talking about running up walls and attacking enemies and that type of verticality and chopping projectiles in half when they're flung at you by enemies, that certainly is enticing. But I think Clockwork Revolution could be in the conversation for Game of the Year in 2024. Next, I wanted to compare the best, the third best games for each presentation, but they're so different that I thought we would go to multiplayer co-op comparisons where 33 Immortals is Xbox's third best game and PlayStation's third best game is a single player. So to meet a decent comparison, we just used co-op offerings from each showcase. So we're going to go with 33 Immortals. It's such an interesting approach to multiplayer and a breath of fresh air. So basically, it's a top down, almost in the style of Hades art style, 33 player co op multiplayer, where you attack and raid dungeons and enemies. And I would love to play this. And we're comparing it to HellDivers 2. Now, HellDivers 2 looks really good. The first HellDivers was really fun. It has a cult following. And I think it now is in a third person view. And I think the enemies look a lot more fearsome in this view. And I think it adds to the game. I think the special effects on the weapon attacks look really fun. There is a zany, almost comical element to Helldivers when you drop mechs and stratagems on your teammates by mistake. Of course, there's also friendly fire is always on. So there's a fun to it with that, but I can only go based on the trailer. So that's the rules. So I have to say HellDivers looked good, but I'm going to have to give this to 33 Immortals for its refreshing take on multiplayer. I definitely want to see what this will have as far as depth and how long it will hold me. But based on the two trailers, I would say 33 Immortals gave the better showing. I love Helldivers though, and there is a chance I have more fun with it. But based on this showing, 33 Immortals will take that. Now let's go to Grand Blue Fantasy Relink versus Towerborn. Based on these trailers, Grand Blue Fantasy looked rather generic, especially in combat. They didn't show NPC relations, and the combat looks very hack and slashy, like your typical hack and slash. Didn't really seem like your attacks had an impact on enemies. I do appreciate the class system where you can use different characters of different types to have different gameplay approaches. But overall, a pretty generic trailer and not super impressive. Towerborn, on the other hand, showed some at least decent storytelling and a unique approach to gameplay through the camera angle. And the combat looks very deliberate and like your attacks have impact on the enemies. Certainly shows that your weapons have some sort of physics. And there were some seemingly pretty interesting play with co op attacks, but based on physics, meaning enemies have realistic physical reactions to your weapon attacks on them. It also seems like you're traveling the map to clear out enemies of an overtaken world. It has some fun looking loot systems to it. Looks like a ball of fun. Seems like you're opening the world for recolonization. For that, I would say Towerborn looks like the better option. Now let's turn to PvP multiplayer offerings. The closest thing to PvP that Microsoft showed at their event is Sea of Thieves, The Legend of Monkey Island. Doesn't seem like from the trailer it changes up a lot about the multiplayer, but it's just a story pack to what they already had with Sea of Thieves. So with this, we're seeing something very familiar. It really doesn't add much. I'm not sure if I'm going to spend a lot of time playing that. On the PlayStation side, we had FoamStars. And honestly, this is one of my more anticipated games of 2023. People easily dismiss it as a Splatoon clone or it's, just nothing but Splatoon, which is definitely not. It has its own elements and it definitely has its own gameplay. And the completionist, which is a YouTuber I'm sure many of you are familiar with, got his hands on it and he himself is very familiar with Splatoon 1 and 2 as he completed it as his YouTube handle suggests, meaning he played pretty much everything you had to play to complete it. And he says from his experience, it's definitely different from Splatoon and he enjoyed it a lot. So a person who actually got their hands on it and said they really like it, and I myself really like it, and I see differences. I see different weapons, different traversal system. It has pet sidekicks. It has its own style. And even on the Microsoft side, Starfield looks a lot like No Man's Sky, and nobody seems to have a problem with it. And nobody subtracts points for that. So we're going to keep the same energy and judge the game on its own merit. The game looks really good, and I choose FoamStars over Sea of Thieves. And now we're going back to our regularly scheduled program, ranking the best games. Final Fantasy 16 versus Avowed. First, Final Fantasy 16. I mean, talk about a dramatic trailer. The almost Game of Thrones esque perspective switching, while meanwhile having a connection and a backstory between these characters that you see, is very interesting. The gameplay does have a sense of combat physics in the midst of some real hack and slashy elements. So there is some realism to the combat, which I will enjoy. It does have some storytelling that gives you the perspective of the NPCs, but nothing really interesting when it comes to NPC relations. Avowed, on the other hand, seems to be very derivative of Skyrim. In fact, I can't really see much difference between Avowed and Skyrim, maybe outside of guns and seemingly a world that is infected by what seems like the cordyceps virus from The Last of Us. I will say the weapon combat seems a lot more impactful than Skyrim, which was a game that I described as combat as almost swinging around a wet newspaper until someone bleeds. So I do like that, but I will choose Final Fantasy 16 over Avowed. Now we'll do Towers of Aghasba versus Dungeons of Hinterberg. And I'm sorry, Towers of Aghasba completely blows Dungeons of Hinterberg out of the water in this matchup. Towers of Aghasba has some dark cloud elements where you're rebuilding society, even to the point of creating building structures and homes for the former inhabitants of the land that you're exploring. And you're also planting tree like vegetation, which becomes towers that you can float between using a glider, the likes of Breath of the Wild. The land is inhabited by colossi along the lines of Shadow of the Colossus. It does follow the legacy created by Shadow of the Colossus, which was passed down the journey and then passed down to Breath of the Wild. They even showed a part where you collect an item off of a floating colossus in the middle of the sky. So you had to jump off a mountain to float onto it to collect said item. I think this game looks beautiful and has some amazing gameplay elements. Dungeons of Hindenburg has some cool surfing traversal mechanics, but the combat seems based on hack and slash and not very action packed for that type of gameplay element either. There is some puzzle solving, but nothing that looks very spectacular, and I would have to give Towers of Aghasba the win in this comparison. Now, this comparison, Microsoft blows PlayStation out of the water when we compare Towers of Fantasy to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, which I believe is a DLC. But it adds career piloting to the game. You have aerial firefighting, search and rescue, helicopter cargo transport, air ambulance, agricultural aviation, mountain rescue, skydive aviation, aerial construction, industrial cargo transport, remote cargo ops, VIP charter service, uh, air racing glider pilots. You can pilot for scientific research, experimental low flight, uh, executive transport, airship service, hot air balloons. I mean, so much to choose from. I wasn't into Microsoft Flight Simulator before, but this game might actually get me into it, or at least try it out. How much gameplay and how many hours I'll put into it, that I'm not too sure. It certainly has a lot of options. Towers of Fantasy, on the other hand, is very derivative of Genshin Impact. It's a gotcha game. It's actually already on PC. Already has some bad reviews. But if we're going to stick by the rules and go based off the trailer alone, it did show some fun gameplay, some robotic horse riding, some third person shooting, I should say. But to be honest, so much of it was cinematic, I can't even tell which one is gameplay in some cases. It does have some city environments which look cool and has some underwater environments, but I'm going to have to give this to Microsoft Flight Simulator. And finally, we have this surprise comparison. We're going to compare PlayStation's Project Q to Xbox Series S, the updated version with 1 terabyte. In my last video, I spoke about how the Series S was a mistake, but it does seem like the Project Q may be Sony's mistake. I guess the question is, which one of these is the bigger mistake, or which one of these is more useful? Based off the presentation, it seems Project Q is only usable through remote play. Some speculate that means you can only use it at home through remote play and through that access. But remote play is accessible outside, technically. You can play it through hotspots and Wi Fi. It does seem like the 1 terabyte Series S has less of a reason to exist. I mean, you can expand storage on the Series S, and regardless of the memory, what do you call it, expansion or upgrade, Microsoft still has to develop to the lowest common denominator, which is the Xbox Series S. So the Xbox Series S is still Microsoft's next gen ball and chain. And the Project Q being more of an accessory to your PlayStation 5, I would say that gives Sony the win by a tiny margin. So if you're keeping score, it would be 5-4 where Xbox wins. But even if Sony had more enticing exclusives, that would give Xbox a run for its money. Xbox showed 2 Game of the Year contenders in 2 different years, and a multiplayer which really seems like it could go viral. This was still a better Microsoft presentation, even if Sony's options were much more viable. So I'm not going to keep you guys any longer. Until next time, take these companies to task, ask for better, never settle for trash. It's your man's boycott, and I'm out.